Today's history workshop seminar is going to be a hybrid seminar. That means we have in-person audience and via Zoom. So for today's speaker, we have Joel. Joel will be speaking to us about his recent article that he's been working on. So what I'll do is I'll quickly introduce our speaker, Joel. Thereafter, I'll give him 20 minutes to present his paper. Thereafter, I'll open up the floor for 20 minutes. For the remaining time for questions or comments. You can either raise your hand or you can comment via Zoom. So, just as a quick introduction, Joel is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Wits University. He is a fellow at the Public Affairs Research Institute and a research at the History Workshop. So we'll just give it a minute just to sort out the lecture slides.
No. Okay, while that's going, thanks everybody for joining. It's a bit overwhelming. I'm speaking to people online and people in a room. So, and I've also just stumbled out of the PhD cave. I'm not used to, and COVID isolation and all of these things. So this is really overwhelming. But I'll try and piece together my thoughts, I guess. So like the article that I sent was something I'd worked on a few months ago for a kind of a special issue around the transition specifically. And it draws out like an aspect of the PhD. So there's some things I'm kind of still working with in that article, and I think that you'll see in the sort of way that I'm framing things now, I've like sort of stretched it and changed it a bit, and I'm trying to, I really need feedback. I'm in the process of writing my introduction also, and it's almost been a kind of 6-month process of trying to work out what concepts are useful and how to hinge the PhD as a whole. So just, yeah. So maybe just let me get this thing going. I need to share my screen, right? Okay. Is that working? Yeah. Okay, so so this piece comes out of research that I was part of a team of people, including Musa, who's here today, looking at the Mogalakwena Municipality. We started the research in 2015, and we were sort of looking at, it was a municipality in the middle of a kind of political crisis. And so what we wanted to do was try and understand that crisis in ways that went beyond sort of the media narrative, which was very like kind of surface level, really individualized the problems. So I'm just going to close the door quick. So I mean, the way that a lot of the media coverage was really individualized and personalized, the kind of events. It was the corrupt mayor, it was the thieving municipal manager, and these kinds of portrayals. And we found that like actually academic literature often spoke in many of the same terms about local government, that actually it was like the problems of local government were an issue of ethics, were an issue of personalities, were an issue of lack of skills among those within. And so our research was trying to understand actually to go inside the municipality for a change and actually understand what kind of a political environment was unfolding. Who were the actors involved and what was shaping this kind of conflictual atmosphere. And what we found was that like really the municipality was a space where so many different actors from all different levels of party and state were intruding, intervening, attending council meetings, like demanding the sacking of this Pearson. So it was actually, rather than like just this kind of container of its own crisis, it was telling us something broader about like bigger crisis, bigger political forces. But what we hadn't really, it was such a kind of hectic atmosphere that our study was quite curtailed. It was between 2009 and 2015. Those were the years that we looked at it. And I, with the PhD project, wanted to consider the much longer term history of that place, and specifically centering space, like centering how space has changed. You know, like municipalities are such spatial entities. They're like as the saying goes, it's like closest to the people, closest to the ground. It's like quite, so much of the daily life of a municipality is spatially directed. So if we don't understand the spaces over which like municipalities reside, we won't understand the kind of crises and difficulties and challenges that like are afflicting municipalities. But out of this has emerged sort of, yeah, let me not put it that way. I think that like what it's shown me is that local municipalities are in fact a very like useful vantage point for looking at longer historical processes. So I sort of set out the study dividing it's sort of spatially orientated. So I look at each of the sort of typologies, broad typologies of space in the area that we could, and I consider from the 1950s especially, but including the sort of colonial period, but especially how the apartheid government set to remake each of these sort of typologies. That so we have like the tribal authorities, the so-called tribal authorities, which were the subject of massive spatial reconfiguration. You know, the creation of the Mogalakwena township, which was of this sort of typology of the so-called Bantu town. Sorry, a lot of people are, which you know, was this particular form which the apartheid state sold as the place where black people could own homes. So it was this kind of like space of an aspirant middle class. This is sort of what it was sold as. Then there was the so-called group area of Acacia, the Indian group area. And then finally the town of Potgietersrus. So I looked at each of these spaces and tried to understand what were the spatial reconfigurations that happened there, and what were the forms of local administration that were developed in each space. And all of those come together in a certain way during the transition period, right? Okay, so I think that, so as much as my study has a broader focus, I think that it can tell us certain things about the way that we study the transition generally, or the stories that we tell about the transition, which, you know, at the risk of straw manning of like huge literature on the transition, there tends to be a focus though around like national elites, that sort of events around the negotiation table are the central fulcrum of change in the 1990s. Certainly other events feed into this. Popular politics is often mentioned in certain senses. Obviously the IFP-ANC conflict is drawn out a lot, but most of that is in the service of looking at, once again, the decisions that were made around the negotiations table. What emerges is kind of like the elite decisions were the central determinant of the transition, of the processes of change. Now, like in that paper, I think what I do is sort of bend the stick too far in the opposite direction, in the sense that like I kind of evacuate elite decisions as having been important. That's not what I really intend. I think that I'm moving, what I want to move towards more is considering the choices of national elite alongside a range of other dimensions of change, what I'm calling dimensions of change. Okay, and so I want to go through each of these. Now, I think that like you'll see I've got 2 at the end, which I'm kind of uncertain about, and I'm not sure whether to include them. But let me start with the second one. So, okay, so obviously I've spoken about the sort of negotiations table. But what I want to do before that, right? The theoretical framework that I've been using is a lot about spatial geographers, from radical geographers and historians of the local. And in particular, the work of Joe Hart, which allows us a way of seeing spaces not as these kind of self-contained bounded units, but rather as spaces of precisely interconnection of all of these different sort of processes, actors, organizations, kind of natural processes, even drought, for instance. As seeing, yes, because often the way that we talk about local places or small towns is as if they are their own kind of contained entities in which local domestic politics goes down, rather than seeing them as spaces where we can actually see the play of a whole range of different processes and aspects and everything. So I think that, you know, that this sort of shift has been undertaken by local historians too, especially at History Workshop. I think that there's like for many years now, quite a strong spatial focus, which is why my work sort of fits in. And so I want to say that using that framework introduces a whole range of other dimensions of change, right? Beyond the choices of the national elite. So, okay, so in terms of geography, the paper was, never mind, okay. In geography, I want to, you know, the first thing, obviously, probably the most literal aspect of a spatial study, when you use a spatial lens, is the physical geography of the space. And I think that, like, you know, it's often sort of underestimated in just how vast and different South African localities are, and how each of these spaces contain such different natural and infrastructural geographies. So, you know, the Mokopane region it's bushveld, it's drought prone, it's like baking hot, and it's also been the space of kind of massive historical spatial reconfiguration, which a lot of scholars have spoken about in the region more broadly. So Peter Delius has written about this in Sekhukhune, Isabel Hoffman and Sikibe Lokhati wrote about the Mokopane area too, precisely about this, about how, you know, this is like, it's really marked by like kind of histories of conquest, forced removal and resettlement. And up until, you know, the 80s, forced removals were going on large scale. I mean, between 1979 and 1980, in the neighboring Ellisras district, but very close, 20,000 people were removed and resettled in the space of a couple months. So that geographical and like that history of space is so alive in politics, as you can imagine. So many of the activists who were going into local government negotiations were first-hand, you know, victims of forced removals and resettlements. There's this really remarkable thesis written in 1987 by Essie Letswalo, and she actually tracks processes of forced removal across the whole region and some of the resettlements. And you know, she really documents how the communities which were well linked into agricultural networks, which had built their own dams in some cases, were uprooted and thrown into like basically drought conditions. So yeah, and then obviously you have the creation of sort of spatial racial enclaves, which the apartheid state really stepped up in a degree of its ferocity. So the Mogalakwena township was created in 1963. And that was after the removal of the old location. And these similar, you know, like some people were moved 10 kilometers just into the boundary of the Leboa Bantustan. I just want to sort of show these. This is from Isabel Hofmeier's thesis from 1991. And she tracks the kind of changes over time in the Voltaire chieftaincy in particular. And you can see that this is from 1953. So you still have sort of homestead settlement patterns and quite sparse settlement patterns. And by 1972, you have the imposition of grid structures. And by 1987, you can see it's a very densely settled area, and this is and it's very spatially circumscribed too, surrounded by sort of farming land that was taken over by white farmers. So how does all of this is the segregation is also sort of instantiated through infrastructure, through roads, through different technologies for the movement of people, and much of that remains. And I think it's Antina von Schnitzler calls it apartheid's debris, which really, the 1990s, that apartheid debris is in fact the infrastructural terrain on which the transition unfolds. That's how what motivates so much politics, and creates the limits and opportunities of action in these spaces. The N1 highway, for instance, that called the Great North Road, it was in fact designed to bypass a whole lot of the white towns, so that black people wouldn't be going to these lily white towns, this column of towns. So it's really and it's a kind of militant brutalist architecture that is throughout the Northern Transvaal, the former Northern Transvaal. So state-created borders of concrete and wire, which aim to keep these areas divided and to govern the forms of interaction that happen between people. And there were physical and obviously psychological means of policing that. And I think that so for instance, the municipality itself was obviously meant to service predominantly white people. The Indian community was expected to use the back door. And so it was really instantiated, obviously, as apartheid everywhere was. It's not exceptional in that regard. But I want to say that in the 1990s, the so-called racial border, or those boundaries, became one of the key determinants of politics in that transition period. So while liberation activists and popular struggles were often aimed at dissolving those boundaries, conservative white politicians and vigilantes, it took on vigilante forms of defending those boundaries. And I think that battle over racialized space sort of reached its apex in the 1990s. As sort of formal protections of grand and petty apartheid fell away, the white right wing sought to protect those spaces through other means, and through this notion of self-government, and defend space sometimes through violence. And space continued to inform the kind of around the municipal transition. When a local government negotiating forum was constituted, the key battle was about what areas to include. And so the white conservatives fought tooth and nail to prevent the municipal boundaries from being extended to include the villages. And then even after, so they created the Greater Potgietersrus Transitional Council, which included only it included Mogalakwena and only 3 of the most proximate villages. But there's villages 40 and 70 kilometers away, which were excluded from that. And even then, the source of conflict in council was about extending the budget to those areas that were included in the Greater. So, white taxpayers' money being spent on black areas was the key area. And I think, beyond those, there's also literally the institutional space of the municipality itself became a battleground of the kind of games and sabotage and obstruction by the municipal manager to prevent the incoming ANC councillors from even knowing what offices what offices where. And, you know, that played out in various other institutions too, various other spaces, institutional spaces like hospitals, schools, and obviously the 1996 large school Potgietersrus example is just one. Okay, so yeah, so that's sort of what I think geography and man-made infrastructures made, like how that shifted the course of the way that the transition unfolded. Yeah. Another one is like local institutions of state. I mean, I say local, but those which had, you could also include those which had a kind of local footprint. So obviously the incoming government had to deal with all of these administrative experiments that have been undertaken in this area. So many different forms. So there was a tribal authorities, and then in Mogalakwena there was a town council of sorts, but there was also the magistrate and the superintendent's office. In Acacia there was the management committee, and in Potgietersrus there was the Conservative Party town council, right? So I mean, I speak about many of these aspects in the thesis. I think the one that probably comes out most strongly in that paper is around the role of the white town councils. So, I mean, from 1982, basically, 1984 was the first moment where the Conservative Party showed the levels of support it had amongst like those small towns across the Northern Transvaal. So the Conservative Party was born as a result of a split in the National Party, where 9 MPs of the National Party walked out after the announcement of the tricameral parliament. That was the first, that was the flashpoint. And so really, like, for them, PW Botha was selling out apartheid already. And they really pushed for a puritanical version of racial segregation, and really exploited fears. Yeah, and they used these town councils across the region as sort of a network of institutional resistance against any forms of the rolling back of segregation, principally segregation. You know, they didn't really have answers about the economic crisis that the country was facing, or it was really about the most proximate kind of level of politics, which was like space. And controlling white space. And they also, you know, many of these councillors were also part of like sort of overlapping associations, including the municipal union, but also various other sort of social clubs, like round table, business chambers, all of this. And so I want to understand those local town councils as sort of one node in a much bigger network of white right-wing resistance to change. And, you know, they didn't really have much of a hold outside of the Northern Transvaal, but I think an underappreciated thing that the Conservative Party achieved during the negotiations was that, so they refused to participate in the national level negotiations, but they did participate in the municipal negotiations. And what they managed to get out of that was a concession that, first of all, there would be, in determining municipal wards, there would be a 50-50 split between formerly white areas and black areas, and that there would be in order to pass any resolution in council, you needed a 2/3 majority, which effectively meant that the Conservative Party councillors had a veto power over decisions at the very moment that there should have been a kind of rapid rollout of it. You know, they were facing emergency conditions also. The 1990s was a period of like devastating droughts in the Northern Transvaal. And so in fact, the need for a highly responsive municipality was never greater. But in that moment, much of the time was spent on kind of trying to soothe tensions, you know, between like people who, you know, the first sittings of the council chambers are like spoken of this like exceptionally conflictual, where people refuse to speak English, and also the, you know, the 2/3 majority thing meant that like ANC councillors, for instance, had to put up with a whole lot of racial abuse that in having tea, and you know, it was such a dehumanizing environment. so much energy of like those like first group of councillors was spent in sort of in that. Okay, so then beyond the role of local state institutions, there's also, I think a study like this brings to the fore, once again, like if you're in a locality, you suddenly see those connections, right, between you're a Conservative Party councillor, but you're also like a member of the business chamber, and you're also a member of the round table, and these kind of, it brings to light a whole lot of different political networks that like intersect with a range of different organizational forms, associations at various scales. And that really sort of shaped the tenor of local and regional politics. So, you know, we could speak about the business chambers. I think I need to speak a lot more about that, but obviously also like this perspective brings 5 minutes. Okay. Helps to disaggregate like liberation or brings to light liberation networks and helps to disaggregate kind of parties, because you know, from this perspective you can start to understand the groupings and sort of ties to local exigencies and what motivates politics, right? So for one thing, also it, you know, brings to light some of the other liberation movements, including Azapo. So Azapo, you know, is not often considered a really important actor, but in this region they had quite a strong presence, especially in certain forms of mobilization. You know, there were advice centers operated throughout areas, townships of the area, where unionization was really a central mode of, you know, conscientization, like forming unions and workplace struggles. And but Azapo in the 1990s refused the demobilization. You know, they continued with armed struggle in the small way that they could. And in 1991, they actually bombed a depot of the Transvaal provincial government just north of Mokopane. They refused to participate in the negotiations process throughout because of the inclusion of Bantustan leaders. So that, yeah, that's one set of actors which like sort of shaped how things unfolded there. I mean, so looking specifically at the ANC, yeah, you can start to delineate the kind of regional groupings, local networks, you know, you're really drawn to the kind of power of individuals in this case. Like you know, many of the campaigns or like forms of activism were really like relied on the strength of individual activists or groups of individuals in exceptionally repressive conditions. Sometimes walking, you know, across the bushveld in the middle of the night to avoid detection, this kind of thing, to give pamphlets to people. You know, so there's a real grounding about what the ANC means, and like almost gives life to this idea that there are many ANCs. And I think that has important sort of considerations about like what happens afterwards. What happens with the transition process is often unhappiness expressed by people at different levels that they're not being included in the process is being taken away from them by higher level leaders. Once again, so like the elite domain and the local and regional are intersecting at all, at many moments at least. Okay, yeah, there's so much more that could be said about all of this. I think, you know, but beyond the liberation paradigm, there's also obviously like a whole range of networks and organizational forms which are like beyond the liberation politics, maybe at an oblique angle to it, you know, but there's obviously the Bantustan elites forms of, you know, Laura Phillips has written a lot about the class stratification in Leboa. And the other forms of pacting, we often speak about the pacting that, elite pacting that happened at the national level. But in fact, you have between local businessmen and some of the Bantustan elites, a long relationship in some cases, economic relationships, in fact, like a kind of, yeah, that constitutes a regional elite. So that form of, yeah, I think Laura speaks best about that. those elites. There's also the middle classes, you know, like in some ways, like there was the growth of a kind of state civil service. Obviously, it was one aspect of a sort of aspirant or nascent middle class. Teachers, policemen, government officials. Some were connected to conservative teachers unions, for instance, which also played added into the whole mix of like organizations. And yeah, okay. And the civil servants in 1993, 1994 were essentially what brought were the final nail in the Bantustan coffin. Like really that brought the board to its knees. Once the police joined in 1994, that was the final moment, right? So, and obviously, you know, it's something I haven't really spoken about, but the Bantustan introduced like particular dynamics, particular exigencies, which were perhaps absent in other places in South Africa. Like my fifth and sixth points, I won't go on long because I haven't really fully worked out whether they are subsets of these others or whether they deserve to stand on their own. But I do think that like kind of understanding histories of resistance, repertoires of mass action, of that responded to those conditions and what the conditions were that like motivated mass action is not always so simply doesn't always so simply feed into this repression resistance paradigm, you know, that in fact like many of the issues that are motivating people are not beyond that kind of national level narrative that we tell about the liberation struggle, that they are local exigencies. And I think that like, and local forms of democracy and decision making, which are feed into the forms of activism. And then finally, like individuals, you know, like I think I've struggled throughout this, and maybe it's the sort of modes of social science that I'm used to, but there's no, the power of individuals in particular moments, you know, has really come out so strongly to me. And when there's a moment of contention, of volatility, right? And the situation can go anywhere, and the sort of actions of an individual can really shape the way that those things shift, right? You know, so on the one hand, there's the obstructionists, those individuals who are just like so hard-assed, like, and their presence in the council chamber, for instance, can derail everything. And then there's those who are so sort of quick thinking or adept at like thinking on their feet and knowing how to shift the situation, right? And it also opens the realm of these kind of unlikely friendships that I encountered where, for instance, John Dombo, who was the first MEC of local government, and Dani Botha, who was a National Party organizer in the Northern Province, worked together intensely to try and demobilize some of the right-wing threat. So Dani Botha had contacts with people in Avia Beer, for instance, and John Dombo and him would go to the farm or whatever and have a beer with this person and say, you know, we're not going to take away Afrikaans. We're not, you know, like these sort of trust building exercises that were undertaken. Both of them were in fact held hostage in Groblersdal by this weird alliance of kind of taxi drivers and white right-wing nationalists, the conservatives. The taxi drivers were motivated about the provincial delineation. They didn't want to be included in the new Northern Province because in Groblersdal they're much closer to the Mpumalanga, you know, so they wanted the center of their operations to be in. Whereas the white right wing wanted self-determination, and so the two of them found common cause and ended up like holding these two hostage, and they spent the night in this hall, you know. And it's just these moments, and a number of times that John Dombo said that like he was phoned and told, you know, don't go home, you're in danger. Like these, and those instances are repeated just so many times by like the power of individuals really to shape the way that things shift and change. And it's a level of the analysis which I struggle the most, obviously, because like representing people in their fullness is like very difficult. But yeah, anyway, let me leave it at that. I think I've gone on. So maybe just to wrap up then, I mean, I think that like, just one thing, because in the paper I had mentioned about periodization, right? And I think I've removed it now because I think, in fact, rather than periodization or timelines of change as being a dimension of change, it's in fact a product of these aspects. So by understanding these sort of dimensions of change, what we see is that, in fact, what we call the transition is one sort of, or rather the political transition, that like political transition, one set of processes which are overlaid or articulate with a whole series of other processes that have long been unfolding, or of different temporal lengths or whatever. But and so actually understanding that sets us free of that kind of the rigid temporality of what transition is, or when the transition begins and ends, rather that we're seeing multiple overlapping processes. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Joel, for that fascinating presentation. So we'll move on to the second part of our seminar, where we are going to allow the audience to pose Joel any questions or comments. You can either raise your hand, or if you are joining via Zoom, you can raise your hand or type in the chat box. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Hey Joel,
one question and question around the way you, not in terms of starting to make basis change there, but in terms of periodization, I mean, in my own research, which is on the provincial level, the 1990s, which I think emerges as a somewhat exceptional space, politically, in terms of the kinds of alliances and coalitions for more progressive change that have space to operate and do a bit. And then that space seems to close down in thousands as a result of all sorts of things. The sort of real the sort of reduction, or you can see it's kind of managerial neoliberal kind of space needs, obviously access concerns, and then there's also this emerging kind of new networks. In the local government space, partly because of the way the the policy was implemented later, we really only have local government forming as we know, kind of in the early 2000s. The transition was pushed further into now, into the present. So how do you periodize the transition? Secondly, it strikes me that as a result, partly as a result of all those dynamics, plus in outside of metros, I think follow that similar pattern to parts. But in rural municipalities, partly because of the sort of control that local or old guard and white community still had over those institutions that are so fundamental to social and political and economic. At the very point at which maybe the new ANC government can start to push for change because it's entering into this new legislative phase from the 2000s, this national level politics is starting to constrain. So it's like this never ending time. It's nice to do these spaces. And then the second is just a comment. It strikes me is that I wouldn't know that I wouldn't put individuals as a second category. Partly because you're dealing with the local. So the smaller you go in scale, agency, you can see agency and agency.
So I think you say it should be included.
It should be like a thread.
If there aren't any other questions or comments, Joel, you can go ahead and we'll go for a second round of questions and comments.
How the infrastructure is so central. The whole way of life, I mean, it's such a militarized society, like so taken up in the of the 80s, where like, you know, most young men are involved in some kind of commando self-defense units. So they do have a commando group there. That was, you know.
I'm sorry, Joel, just remember to unmute.
So, you know, they were undertaking campaigns alongside the Limpopo police and alongside the security branch, and, you know, various spaces became like, were used for those, you know, including the traditional authority councils and the butcher's shop, and, you know. I think one of the results of this is that like many people were armed. And so in fact, the Boeremag people come from Potgietersrus. Let's Pretorius, who was like organizing that boycott of the defense of the hospital. Him and his 3 sons were arrested in a hut outside. In fact, Amit Kachali is online. He showed me the hut where they hid out, you know. And that was 2002, 2003, because they laid a bomb on the road that Mandela was going to open a high school, and they laid a landmine, but they were arrested. And I spoke to another person who lived in Potgietersrus, and she was like, yeah, we were driving up from Joburg that day, and they were stopping all of us at the toll gate. We didn't know what had happened, and then word spread that, yeah, like Let's has been arrested. And she said the first reaction of most people was, we got to get rid of all of our guns. Like, because so many people had guns in their homes, and they suddenly had to, you know, so that sort of tells you about the kind of level of security threat. I think it's, you know, I don't want to say it's unique, but like it really seeped in so deep. There's one story that somebody told me how they were visiting their friends, for instance, who made self-brew beer. And while they were all sitting there, all of the caps hit the, you know, like something went wrong with the brew. And so all of the caps were hitting the ceiling, and they all got under, you know, really thought that they were under attack. So I think that like really they were, and if you read in the newspapers, it's such a, yeah. But how that like shifts in the post-apartheid period is interesting. So I don't actually know about like some of the actors during that transition, apart from, you know, Let's and this. But so, for instance, the like Potgietersrus station commander left in the 90s and formed a security company, which has like night vision goggles and like helicopters and stuff, and really like funny how things come together in strange ways, because when the factional battles were happening at the municipality in 2014, 2015, one of the DA councillors who's plugged into those networks called him, and he got a whole lot of people to drive their bakkies and form a laager around the municipal council chambers to protect their, you know, the municipal manager that was like, so anyway, yeah, but there was a lockdown of the formerly white suburbs on that, and there were bakkies in every corner. So it's very much like still, and farm murders have become a kind of flashpoint or whatever, like around securitization, but yeah. So like with the periodization, you know, I guess it's like, I struggle because sometimes we want to say we are eternally in transition, we're still in transition, and it starts to lose its utility. And I think it's useful to talk about a political transition. Like that's where I've sort of landed. We need the term, it's helpful. Like in terms of like grand scale sort of a regime shift, I mean, it has to like be acknowledged for that. But part of what I was really reading a lot about is like sort of transitology, or this whole field that emerged around that time, about explaining transitions. You know, suddenly like, especially from after the end of the Cold War, obviously, but transition became the term, and sort of unproblematically, uncritically used, almost as a technical term. But in fact, transition was laden with a whole lot of precisely those kind of end of history notions about, you know, suddenly like 100 countries or something in the 1990s were said to be transitional societies. And then by the early 2000s, those transitional societies really, you know, like to call the Democratic Republic of Congo as a society on the way to a democratic, you know, began to become a bit meaningless. And so in fact, like one of the key transitologists, this guy, Thomas Carruthers, he was Washington apparatchik, was like calling for the end of the transition paradigm. He said actually, and interestingly, transitology, so it emerges in the 70s as some fringe kind of Dankvat Rosto, like spoke about this. And it was really sped along by this, like watching democratic transitions in countries that they thought would never have democracy, authoritarian regimes suddenly fell. And the transitologists came to this conclusion that actually structure doesn't matter. Actually, like all that matters for a democratic transition is elite consensus. That if you have elites around a table and they want democracy, that's enough. And so it's interesting. I was really like in a sort of rabbit hole about this stuff too, because, you know, I don't want to claim that South Africa's transition was hijacked by transitologists from, you know, it's like that is an old brand. But I do think that there's some of the conceptual universe we haven't fully shrugged off about, like, you know, and so Carruthers' critique of the transitologists was, yes, actually structure is very important. Economic, political, social, other, and the state is important, which was another aspect which was like de-emphasized by the transitologists. They were assuming that they were dealing with a similar kind of state. And anyway, so but back to wherever. So yeah, periodization. I think like I've much more settled on sort of change over time, whatever. But I think that your comments about the, like it's so insightful about the 2000s was this period when precisely the kind of national politics began to really impede on the space of, and I think that, you know, the 2000s is a sort of black hole in my like analysis, because it was because of the conditions, especially of like doing research in Mokopane. I had to continually, you know, try and affirm that I wasn't interested in more contemporary politics. And so as a result, the 2000s has kind of fallen from view. But I think that taking this thing is like, we need to also then understand how sort of local groupings of the ANC are like, and especially with the rise of the regions from the 2000s, from the end of the 2000s, like how does that happen? Like what are the processes? And there's various explanations given sort of for the like rising militancy of the other groups, lower groupings of the ANC. And some of that is sort of generational, you know, decline, that kind of argument, the young people came in and they've like ruined everything and they just want positions and that kind of thing. But I think that there's a much more complex story that is happening between national, local and regional ANC. But yeah, anyway. Yeah, open up for more questions.
Perfect, thanks, Joel. Any other questions or comments? Kosande and then.
Joel, very interesting. So my comment, I hope you won't throw this. I think we've spoken about this before. you and I sort of comparison with other African countries. And it's difficult to compare South Africa, neighboring countries in the region, because you know, in African studies, there's this sort of settler versus so-called non-settler society. Zambia, right, is called a non-settler society. But have you thought about how your work could have implications for how we understand, you know, the region? And it's difficult because, again, places in Africa and there's in the 60s, this transition is.
Yeah, no, it's crucial. Yeah, I haven't considered it. I know I should. I know I met somebody who was involved in the Zimbabwean local government transition stuff from the 80s and 90s. I think that's like obviously a useful comparisons. Thanks, Casimir.
We not had another hand.
Yeah, thanks all. It's a very interesting presentation. I didn't get to the end, so maybe trust this. I think I found it so rich and interesting how you kind of play with theory and thinking about change. And you just introduced me to Jurassic World. Never as a field of study. And it strikes me like in the second slide, the fourth slide, when you have those elements that help you think about the dimensions of change in the local. So the immediate question that is when you mentioned the field of study that looks at changes in political regime one to another is what would this say in terms of I think that's actually like a really interesting contribution for to this. You go to cover it also in the PhD.
To the field of transitology, to understanding the transition. I mean, I think, you know, what I would say is that the choices of national elite are not irrelevant, right? Which is sometimes what comes out in that first iteration of the paper, almost like. But that choices of national elite need to be read alongside or as sort of articulating with different geographies, natural and infrastructural, different institutions of state, localized networks, you know, and yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but I mean, there's a part of the transitology literature which is just so sort of repugnant in a way, because so many of those people were involved in creating the change that they wanted to see, right? The transitologists were not simply academics, or they were involved. I mean, Samuel Huntington was, you know, it's difficult to classify him neatly as a transitologist, you know, but these were people hired as consultants, right? To be, you know, how do you arrange a transition? You speak to people who have done transitions elsewhere. It's like, you know, down to the program, IDASA is, you know, there's various of these think tanks which are also, and I don't want to all lump them in the same category, but I do think that there was a conception of how change is brought about by society. And I think one of the things is about national institutions as being decentral, like, you know, so there's an understanding of change that if you create a constitution, a reformed judiciary, and elections, a representative parliament, that change will flow from that, from the top to the bottom. And you know, I think that was indicative of the kind of the way, like, that the state reform was. Am I right, Sarah? That it was more marginalized in the kind of negotiations process. I don't, you know, it's not about like the whataboutism or whatever. You know, there was a space for local government, and there were many people involved in that. But like, it seems that like the vast majority of the energies were about like arguing about human rights, for instance. All of these things are, but that is a particular paradigm of change. No? The human rights discourse is an understanding of how you bring change to society, is that you have a Bill of Rights, which is, and yeah, so anyway. But interestingly, I think also, and maybe this is stretching it, but some of those people who are involved, I don't want to call them transitologists, but many people who have written about the transition also had close relationships with particular networks of the ANC who were sitting in the scenario plannings. and all of those, you know, so like, and yeah, let me just say, like, Patrick Bond was involved in sort of some of that scenario planning and stuff, and it's very interesting to read his book with that consideration, because I was looking at it with the critique of the transitology in mind, because he gives a structural, the first two chapters are about like the overaccumulation of capital as being the explanation for why apartheid crumbled, right? The surplus capital and like the crisis of markets and not being able to like sell luxury goods, you know, that there was a glutton. And then it moves to a very personalized, you know, so you have the broader structure, then you have the scenario planning, you know, where it's all about individuals, where suddenly in that space, like anything is possible. And I also do acknowledge your point almost about like the transition as being a space of openness, you know, where like really there was like a moment of, and I don't want to dismiss that. And I also don't want to dismiss the kind of importance of the macroeconomic decisions that were made and that kind of thing. But it's just much of that must also stem from people's proximity to the processes. It's there's a certain level of ethnography or auto-ethnography involved in some of these. I don't know if that's fair. Like,
Okay, perfect. So I see you. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry.
One of the things that which brought to mind is that the transitional structures coming up towards 1999 essentially have real effects on the ground. I think we sometimes concluded in a sense, you know, they were just transitional things. They actually did seem to have real effects. And the flip side of that is, as a removal of that in 1999, they have some very decisive impacts. In terms of, you know, a lot of those structures that say the surgery are not able to use, then actually do. Then you do have real, much more real transfer, certainly a formal pressure.
sure.
Yeah. What effect is that?
Right. No, you're right.
So just Louis' question, we can.
Thanks, John. I think the discussion has been very productive. I just wanted to push a little bit on the issue of space, local and different scales. You know, I think we entirely right to push against the idea of bounded space and the implications of that. Emphasizing the openness, velocity of boundaries and the like. So the two questions, comments. The first is, I think this may follow on from what Clive was raising. And that is, I think, also about countervailing the processes. So you're emphasizing openness, velocity. Are there inflection moments in which certain processes that could be institutional, they could be political, social, and so on, in which crystallization happens, where boundaries, in a sense, potentially become more manifest, if not rigid, but not completely bounded. So seems to me that we're emphasizing one process, are they countervailing processes? And then I'm wondering, you know, you make important points about the articulation in different scales, local, regional, and within those different other kinds of spaces, like the former homeland. I just want to explain the articulation between those different spaces. What are the determinants that help us understand? Because as it stands, you are describing a complex intersection and articulation between different states. Should one try to explain the relationship, the articulation, when does one become more determinant than the other? Or are you just saying that they're complex and they can satisfy the complexity? But I just want to explain it. Right? And then finally, related to the articulation of different scales, and this may relate to the point that Mason's made. When one takes all of this into account, can one, does one want to, make any argument about the distinctiveness of a particular space, which is the focus of the research. And finally, our recommendation for the classification, which is primacy and transientology.
Agreed.
So if there are no more hands, you can answer those questions and then maybe give your final remarks.
These are the, yeah, you got to the, the heart of the thing. Yeah, the removal of the transitional structures, like, and what does it mean? Because in some ways, because of my time period, there's an exaggeration of that space as being one of, and in fact, the white conservatives emerge as the biggest villains out of that. But actually assessing the overall and longest term impacts, their long term impacts is like uncertain, right? Like, there's some narratives which are actually say that transitional space allowed for sabotage, basically. That like in that period, because so many of those managers stayed on, so many documents went missing. Like the asset registers, people walked in and didn't know what the municipality owned. And maybe I related in that like story about how the district, somebody working at the district municipality got a phone call from a farm worker who was saying, on our farm, they're digging deep trenches and parking municipal trucks in a different municipality, not this one, parking. So there was outright theft, in that period. But assessing the scale of that is difficult. And yeah, was the removal of the Conservative Party as a factor suddenly a space of massive openness of, where it's, and I think that people do sort of narrate that, the 2000s period is in many ways narrated by some of those municipalities when they got the road done or when they got the sports complex finished, finally, like, and it's quite like disheartening to speak to many of those administrators now who have long been turfed out of the municipality to watch all of those structures fall to pieces. Like, but yeah, so that period is narrated, and there was an HP, Hewlett Packard opened a kind of innovation center, and like really there seemed to be kind of what that means, I don't know, but in terms of actual like local economic development, but and also people's narratives are rose tinted by what happened afterwards, which is extreme levels of conflict and assassination, and so that like and also I wasn't able to get into the municipal archives, and so like there's so much of that which I think would help clarify some of these questions. I mean, the one comment that the deputy mayor said was like, I said after the Conservative Party people were gone, now were you much freer? And she said, well, no, then we had the traditional leaders to deal with, like, because that was, I guess, the high time of, especially around determining the kind of mandates of municipal traditional leaders. Plus you have the mine, which is a massive thing which I haven't mentioned at all. But that, really fundamentally, I think if we're talking about like what the most determinant thing for people is far beyond the kind of elite negotiations or whatever. Of course, mining agreements are part of this too, so you can't divorce them. But it's the like wall of rubble that keeps moving towards people's homes and hasn't stopped since then, and has produced in its wake so many sort of environmental health and like it's forced removal once again. So yeah, but anyway, I'm not sure if that was a satisfactory answer, but yeah, but those transitional structures really did mean something. Also, another aspect is many of the white administrators left, formed open consultancies, and then got contracts for the municipality because the only person who knows all of it, Musa and I interviewed this guy, the only person who knows the electricity, how every electrical wire is placed in the town is this one super obvious beer guy who's opened his own consultancy in Ellisras. And that was Lepelale, like, so similar patterns like that. Or like one guy was the property, the former planner, yeah. And he knows exactly how that Byzantine sort of filing system works. And that's the thing about like, you have to know how the filing system works. And so he just waltzes in, everybody says hi to Dries, and he, and he made a fortune off of speculating in the run up to Medupi too. So anyway, so, you know, there are more subtle ways in which like there's continuing economic, and I think if I investigated deeper into some of the kind of economic power that many of these people continue to hold, you know, I was interviewing, and interesting linkages, right, with new ANC politicians. Like, I was interviewing one former chief whip of the ANC at Spur, and then this former National Party guy came up and was like, and I had interviewed him like a week before, you know, so we were chatting, and then he's like, how's that deal going? And it turns out he's buying a zinc mine up in, you know, so interesting new relationships and which are formed over that. No, I guess, you know, I think, in fact, your comments has helped me in some way, because sometimes it feels as if that spatial analysis, which views all of these different things, one of the outcomes is that there's no determinant force, right? Which can be helpful, but also quite Foucauldian in the sense of demobilizing or whatever, you know, it's just complex and everybody has power and all of that. And I think that's right, to periodize it, to look at particular moments and see where actors from different scales may have had more power. I think the 1990s period of demobilization of the local was massive, you know, so as much as so many people will complain about being left out of the negotiations process, they say that now, but many will admit that they were so taken by Mandela euphoria, by Rainbow Nation euphoria, that their critical faculties were let go of, right? And I think, I mean, it's just so clear that you have national party, members of the national executive of the ANC pushing a line, like, and by the time it gets to branch level, you're being told what's happening at Kempton Park, but you're not speaking back at all. You're being told to demobilize. You are not going to protest against the traditional authorities, even when they're continuing with the taxation. That line is solid, and I think so. Yeah, I think there's interesting levels of contingency between the national and provincial leadership, which introduces certain kind of, and there's a relative proximity of provincial to, you know, again, so sometimes provincial leaders are, yeah, charting their own path somewhat in some of the like flux, that period of flux. So again, yeah, a study, real ethnographies of the ANC are so like crucial to understand, you know, what happens in these offices in the regional office. And so I was caught, I think, in the Zuma period of thinking that the region, and I still think that the regional ANC is immensely powerful and has grown more powerful over time. And part of that has been through its control over municipalities, control over the tendering, and control over appointment procedures within municipalities. A region in Waterberg has 6 municipalities. And in our region, there was like one predominant family that has essentially controlled many of those. It's complicated, of course. And I have been arguing that in many ways, the tail is wagging the dog, right? Because the national leaders, if you want to be elected, if Ramaphosa wanted the votes of the Waterberg to be elected, he has to get on board those regional secretaries, regional leaders. People also get played, you know. So, I mean, in one with the 2017, with the CR17 campaign, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma went to the Waterberg and was promised that everybody would vote for her, but they voted for Ramaphosa, you know. And so, but what we are seeing is the step-aside rule is actually playing a role in many of those people are actually being forced to resign. And I think, yeah, that has had like significant impact on politics. Whether it will hold, and it's under attack, you know, but it makes a difference that that key people and also deployed within the municipality have been told to step aside. So I think that is, yeah, once again, hard to see what's determined. Maybe I overview the role of the region, but I still think it's like, and it's about money and like, you know, and tracking where money sits and where like it's just so beyond and I think requires much longer term sort of.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Joel. So I think that concludes our seminar. Thank you, Joel, for your presentation, and thank you for our audience for participating. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for organizing this.